Welcome back to Wellness with Delaney. If you're watching the video version, you might be seeing a familiar face. That is because we have Dr. Anthony Chaffee back on today. When we did our podcast earlier this past year, you guys had so many questions. And I was like, let's just bring him back on, bring the expert back on. We can ask him all the questions, all of the hot burning questions that are on your mind, and just get it straight from the source. So, Dr. Chaffee, thank you so much for coming back.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. It's good to see you.
It's great to see you as well. Okay, so first of all, one thing that I've heard a lot when we initially started talking about carnivore, because I think our conversation was the first of many carnivore conversations that I started to have this year. But I started getting people approaching me like, okay, Delaney, I'm hearing this. This is great. Like, I understand the need to eat more meat, more protein, more fat. But then what about people like Paul Saladino, right?
hmm
And, we see people who, like him, who he kind of popularized carnivore in a way for a huge crowd of people, and then
hmm
switched to more animal based. And they're like, Delaney, I'm confused. What's going
hmm
on? What's the truth? And I don't know how to answer them, but I know you do.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the thing is that Paul eats a lot of fatty meat and things like that. He understands that that's our primary energy or nutrient source is really important to get that. And he also understands about plant toxins. Plants
Yeah.
have defensive chemicals that they use to protect themselves. And that's really important because those defense chemicals can harm you to varying degrees. He sort of went down this guy named Ray Peat,
Mm-hmm.
who had these ideas about how you need carbohydrates for all these different sorts of reasons, and that if you don't have them, you can cause stress and elevated cortisol. It can drop your thyroid, things like that. Those things actually haven't been borne out by experimental data or even observation, though. And
Mm.
so Ray Peat, while people still follow him, had some ideas. Then he portrayed them in a very sort of appealing and provocative sort of way. So people thought like, wow, this makes a lot of sense. But when we actually look at the long-term randomized controlled trials, it actually doesn't show any of the results that he would predict. So a theory is only as good as what it's able to predict. And his theory does not predict anything. And so it's not a very good theory. It's nice, but it didn't actually flesh out, because the long-term randomized controlled data in humans on ketogenic diets show that there is no elevated cortisol, that there is no drop in your thyroid function, for
Wow.
example. And this is looking at people that 2 years or beyond. And so some
Wow.
people will say, well, look at this study that 17 obese males, and they've gone it for 4 weeks, and it changes their cholesterol metabolism or their cortisol metabolism. And it's just like, okay, so there's a transient bump in cortisol that sort of comes up a little bit, but then it goes down within a few weeks. And even in that study, it showed that and this is the reason I mentioned this one is this is when someone that said to me like, "Oh, if only we had studies showing that you were wrong. Look at this." And there's 17 people and it was on for 4 weeks. So first of all, very small study, very specific patient, there's obese males, so that's not going to be generally translatable to everybody. And it's also very undersized, underpowered. There's only 17 people and didn't go long term. It's only 4 weeks, and even then, it showed no elevation in cortisol. So what are we doing here?
Mm.
You don't get elevated cortisol, and also when you do have a little bit of a bump, it goes up and down and things like that. It's still within physiologically normal levels. And just because your cortisol changes doesn't mean that that's bad. You get Cushing's disease, you get hypercortisolemia, meaning that you have very high cortisol that has very serious metabolic and physiological stresses on your body. Your face starts getting wider. It's called moon faces. You get a big lump on the back of your neck. It's called a buffalo hump. And you start getting a very expanded abdomen as well. That's a Cushing's disease or Cushingwood syndrome when you have very high cortisol levels. You don't get that on on ketogenic diets or carnivore diets at any stage. That's never been shown anywhere. And I've been in ketosis for about a decade, and I'm certainly don't think I'm manifesting those exterior features. But also in mainstream medicine right now, we actually use ketogenic diets in order to counteract high cortisol levels. So when someone has
Mm.
Cushing's disease and their cortisol levels are through the roof, we actually put them on ketogenic diets in order to ameliorate the negative effects of that high cortisol. So if this were going to exacerbate and make the high cortisol levels worse, that wouldn't be a very good intervention, would it? But actually, that's exactly what we use, and that it helps dramatically. So, um, you know, Dr. Saladino felt that that explained the issues that he was having. I think there were other issues that he was having, and I'm very convinced about that because I had been in a ketogenic state on a carnivore diet longer than he had at that time, and I hadn't seen any of those problems. I'd never seen any of those problems in my patients, and we don't see that in the literature. And I did a whole review on this called "Is Ketosis Harmful?" on my YouTube channel. We just really do a deep dive into this, and we look at the studies that they're talking about, and we sort of break those down, and we say, okay, well, that's with this many people in 4 weeks. Okay, what about at 8 weeks? What about at 2 years? It was a very different story at that point. In my practice, I don't see people having cortisol issues. I don't see people having thyroid issues. In fact, I'm seeing them reverse their thyroid issues. So, Paul felt that helped explain his issues. I don't see those issues in my patients. I don't see those issues in myself. So whatever were causing his problems, he was saying he was having thyroid issues. He was saying he was having, some testosterone changes, things like that. I don't think that I'm convinced, in fact, that it wasn't from ketosis because studies show that ketosis doesn't cause that. And none of my patients have had that for long-term periods of time, much longer than he has, that he tried it himself. Also, even this is sort of accepted even in the mainstream, which doesn't necessarily say all that much. There's a lot of things accepted in the mainstream that are wrong, but the National Academies of Science and the Institute of Medicine have actually made a public statement saying that the amount of carbohydrates that you need throughout the entire course of your life is 0.
Wow.
And that there are entire populations and civilizations that have lived for thousands of generations without any carbohydrates whatsoever, or very little to no carbohydrates whatsoever. And they've had no deleterious effects on their health and no negative effects on their longevity. So that's something that's actually been pretty well studied for long-term, throughout the course of people's entire lives. We've actually studied this generationally, and we don't see any actual negative effects. And in fact, there are thousands of studies showing the long-term benefits of being on a ketogenic diet for specific medical outcomes, for reversing metabolic syndrome, for reversing diabetes, lowering blood pressure, improving Parkinson's, improving Alzheimer's. Is being used in ketogenic metabolic therapy for cancer now, using for autoimmune diseases, and especially carnivore diets, plant-free ketogenic diets being used for autoimmune diseases as well. So you get massive benefits from being in this ketogenic state. In fact, most animals on Earth are in a ketogenic state because 70% of animal species are carnivores, so they're eating fat and protein. They're not getting carbohydrates. So they have to be in that sort of that stress state, that fasting starvation state. It's not a starvation state. That's our normal metabolic state. If you change the word ketosis and just replace it for what it actually is, which is a fat burning metabolism, then that doesn't sound so crazy. Ketosis is bad. No, you're in a fat burning metabolism. You store fat for a purpose. That's our main energy storage. And now you're in a fat burning metabolism, so you can use that. It's the equivalent. The analogy is, you have like a tanker truck that's going to refill gas stations. So they have 50,000 gallons or 20,000 gallons of gas behind them, but they only have 50-gallon tanks for their own engine, and they can run out of gas. Ironically, seeing as that they got 20,000 gallons of gas behind them, but they can't access that. Okay, so that's like when you eat carbohydrates and your insulin goes up, and you block your body's ability to access your fat stores. Why would you have those fat stores? Why would nature put that in place as a energy reserve if you can't even access it under normal conditions? That doesn't make any sense. So being in a fat burning metabolism, you just access your fat. So you eat food, you store it, and then you run on that. Just like you fill up your gas tank at the gas station, then you drive around for the week and you go fill it up again, right? And that's what animals do. Even herbivores that eat fibrous plants, which are the majority of herbivores, they don't break down that fiber into glucose and absorb the glucose. It's the bacteria and the microorganisms that break down the glucose, and they eat the glucose. And as a byproduct, they make saturated fat, and then they die off and they get absorbed and digested by the animal. So actually the herbivores are actually growing and farming their gut microbiome. And so they're producing a lot of fat, and then they're breaking that down. They're eating that bacteria that dies off. And that's where they're getting their fat and protein from. They don't get carbohydrates. So even cows get 80% of their calories from fat and 20% from protein, and gorillas about 70-30. And so talk about, we eat all these plants and we can be like a gorilla and be all big and tough. They can break down fiber into fat and protein. We can't. And so we need to get that fat and protein from an animal who's already done the hard work for us. But we're getting the same thing. It's fat and protein, fat and protein, fat and protein. So gorillas and cows that are just eating plants, they're absorbing fat and protein. So they're not running on carbs, they're running on fat. Again, we all run on fat. So if we were carnivores and we needed to run on carbohydrates, and that was our main state, and this other state was a stress state, we would be basically one of the only species of animal that did that. I mean, you're talking about hummingbirds and bumblebees that are basically the ones around drinking nectar and sugar and things like that. Who knows what they metabolize that into? Probably protein and fat. But for the vast majority of animal life on Earth, we're predominantly eating protein and fat, not carbohydrates.
Wow. Okay. So a lot of thoughts here. One, what you mentioned with that bump in cortisol, like the little bump, that actually checks out so much because I've talked to people who are like, Delaney, I tried carnivore for a couple weeks and like maybe 2 weeks into it, I just felt like really heightened awareness and it kind of scared me, like maybe a little stressed. And so I quit. And I'm like, I'm wondering if a lot of people quit because they don't get over that hump, if you know what I mean? Like they
Could
don't
be.
kind of push through. So I just thought that was interesting. But this is a really natural segue as well. So mentioning kind of just the carbs versus protein. I know you recently have been in a little bit of internet beef with another creator who was doing a lot in the carnivore community and recently started talking about like a switch up of actually, you know, the carnivore diet is not it, and carbs don't create insulin resistance. They reveal problems that are already there. You know what I'm talking about? I would love to hear your thoughts on that because, you know, I'm hearing there's a little back and forth on like what's going on here, like with the gluconeogenesis, or like is it only possible to be healthy and have healthy insulin on carnivore, or is there an opportunity for carbs to like have a similar effect?
No, well, not the same effect. I mean, there's more than one way to skin a cat, but you know, there is an optimal way too. And so, the thing is too is that even if you had normal insulin resistance and you weren't diabetic, you would still be getting glucose spikes. That heightened glucose causes damage. It's called glycation. Carbohydrates physically fuse to other molecules, and through glycation they cause advanced glycation end products, and and it's called AGEs. They physically age you. And so they damage your blood vessels. They damage all the molecules in your in your bloodstream, and so this causes harm and buildup over time. And then you have this spike in blood sugar, and then you have a spike in insulin, and then maybe those come down to normal. Great. There's still area under the curve that you're getting damaged, and that spike in insulin massively deranges your other hormones and other physiological mechanisms such as autophagy. It shuts down autophagy. So insulin affects hundreds of different pathways in your body. And when you do that big spike and actually stays up for quite some time, if you're eating multiple times a day, you're constantly keeping your insulin up. And even if it comes back down when you stop eating, you haven't stopped eating, right? So when you do eating, you're keeping it up and you're causing damage and physiological stress. And that causes all sorts of knock-on problems. It can cause infertility. High insulin blocks the conversion of testosterone into estrogen in women's ovaries. So they get high testosterone, low estrogen. That can cause PCOS, which is the number one cause of female-driven infertility worldwide. It causes a reduction in testosterone in men because insulin resistance, having chronically high insulin levels or even spikes and continuous spikes of insulin, actually lowers the luteinizing hormone receptors on your Leydig cells in your testes, which make testosterone. So LH signals the testes to make testosterone, then they make testosterone. But if you reduce those receptors, even the same signal will only give a partial result. So, and then it blocks growth hormone. Growth hormone is also termed the hormone of youth. It keeps your tissues growing, healing, and repairing. All the celebrities and things like that, they're like 60, they look like they're still 24. Most of them are on growth hormone, right? Wow. They're injecting this. So if you're eating carbohydrates, you're suppressing your own natural production. It blocks the production and action of growth hormone. And so, you know, that's obviously going to impede your body's ability to regrow and regenerate your tissues, and you age faster, just like those AGEs. We find these AGEs, the advanced glycation end products, in all sorts of diseases. It damages the blood vessels, and those small blood vessels end up crinkling off and dying. It can cause atherosclerosis and heart disease. It's the leading cause of heart disease is high blood sugar. It's the leading cause of kidney failure because it damages the blood supply to kidneys. The leading cause of adult onset blindness because it damages the vessels in the retina. The leading cause of having to get your legs amputated. is high blood sugar, because you're damaging the blood supply, and then you have to get amputations. So it doesn't matter if you're full-blown diabetic or not, you're still getting these spikes. And so you're getting that damage under the curve. The gentleman you're referring to, I mean, talks about gluconeogenesis, talks about, the man has never taken biochemistry in his life. It's very clear to anybody who's taken biochemistry that this man has never studied biochemistry. He is, he's just being fed lines. He has no idea what he's talking about. He's just repeating what someone has told him to do. And that's just, he's just an online influencer, or he's trying to be. He's in his mid-50s. He should be nearing retirement and spending time with his grandkids. And yet he's trying to be an online influencer, restarting that career. So it's not him saying this. And also, he has admitted he's never been carnivore. He's never even been ketogenic. He says he's never gone below 100 to 150 grams of carbs a day. And yet he lies and says that, oh, I went carnivore and this happened. Oh, I went ketogenic and that happened. You've never done either. So what are you talking about? And so he's just making things up. And like I've known him for a while. We worked on some projects together. And so I sort of reached out and said, hey, this biochemistry is not actually right. Like, degree in biochemistry and molecular cellular biology. Like, you're getting, this isn't correct. And instead of saying like, oh, okay, well, let's talk about this or whatever, it was just instant animosity, instant pushback, and just trying to drive up some sort of, argument on his post so that it drove up his algorithm. Because let's be frank, he has a fake account. If you look at it just a few weeks before all this started, he has supposedly over 80,000 subscribers. He was having posts that had 0 likes, 0 comments. Right? That doesn't happen when you have 80,000 plus followers that are legitimate. And someone would have 10 likes, 1 comment, things like that. That was the majority of them.
Yeah.
Up until very recently, now he's trying to drive up the algorithm to get this controversy going, so that he can get his platform seen, so that he can push and sell his steroids and hormone replacements and peptides and things like that, which is his business, right? And funny enough, I don't take any of that stuff. I don't need any of that stuff. None of my patients do either. So if his ideas on nutrition are so good, why does he need hormones and I don't? Why do his clients need hormones and mine don't? Things like that. But the idea of gluconeogenesis is much more complicated than he understands. But he and that camp of the Ray Peters, and that's who he's getting fed by. He's getting fed by these guys. I mean, you write a comment, things like that. Takes him a day and a half to respond, because it's not him responding. He says, hey, these guys said this. What do I say back? And they basically give him a response. And it doesn't address the actual issues. It's always a deflection and changing the subject. And so there's it's not, so they know that they're wrong, but they just won't discuss it and try to defend their ideas. They just try to shift and position themselves in different ways. So the idea with gluconeogenesis, what they assert is that you can have gluconeogenesis through protein degradation from catabolizing your muscles. Okay, you don't actually break down your muscles when you're in ketosis until you've completely run out of fat, as you can see, right? If I could share a screen, I could show you all the old school bodybuilders back in Arnold Schwarzenegger's day and before. They were all in ketosis. They used ketogenic diets. They used carnivore diets. Serge Nubret is one of the best physiques that has ever existed. He was Arnold Schwarzenegger's body idol. That's who Arnold Schwarzenegger is saying, I want to look like him.
Oh, wow.
And and absolutely shredded. The guy would not eat anything except meat for 3 months before competition. Might dabble in some other things outside of that, but he was mostly just eating meat year round. 3 months before, it was nothing. He would eat 6 pounds of horse meat a day for 3 months leading up to it. And he was shredded. I mean, he had like 2% body fat, one of the best muscular physiques of all time. And he was actually outspoken against steroids. So we don't know for sure what he did, but he was definitely said, you don't need these things. The way you eat and the way you train can produce all the steroid hormones that you need. And so if we were in ketosis and this just broke down your muscles, then obviously that wouldn't work very well for those bodybuilders like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who again, leading up to competition, very low carb. And but Serge Nubret was definitely just meat for 3 months. So when you are just getting into ketosis, or you're just switching fasting for a period of time or whatever, you can start using some of your proteins. And when you're eating carbohydrates and you run out of carbohydrates, then you can actually tap into your muscles because your insulin is too high. That blocks your fat burning. And so you can't burn your fat. So you can't generate glucose, blood sugar, and ketones from your fat. So you have to find it from somewhere. And then you might be able to, and you might damage your muscles. So it's, oh no, you need to keep eating carbs. You cut into your muscles. Only when you're not in ketosis. When you go into ketosis or you've been fasting for a while, at first you have a bit of a bump on protein metabolism for gluconeogenesis, production of glucose. And then after a couple of days, it's well into fat burning. There's something called the glycerol pathway, which is the main pathway for gluconeogenesis. There's like 5 different pathways for gluconeogenesis, not just protein. Protein is actually the last phase of this, right? If you run out of all these other things. So you have triglycerides, right? So that's how your body stores fat. So there's 3 fatty acids stuck to a glycerol backbone. That splits off. These 3 things turn into, you get used for energy from fat oxidation or can be turned into ketones. And then this glycerol backbone, that gets turned into glucose. So as your body's breaking down fat, you are automatically producing glycerol that is available for gluconeogenesis. So a certain proportion of the energy that you produce will always be from glucose or from that glycerol turning into glucose. So you absolutely don't have to cut into your muscles because when you're burning fat, you're automatically producing glucose and glycogen.
Mhm.
If you have an excessive amount of protein and amino acids, your body wants to store that, you can do that. And some might be used as energy, but the predominant form is from fat. And that's exogenous proteins. That's the proteins that you eat that at no point will you cut into your muscle tissue when you're in ketosis, as long as you have fat available. That will be the very last point that your body will access energy from. And there's multiple others. People can look this up. And you just go on ChatGPT. What are the different types of gluconeogenesis? What are the main forms when you're in a long-term ketogenic state? It will tell you. It's very clear. Another major form is from the lactate pathway. So there's certain tissues in your body that have to use glucose because they don't have mitochondria and some for other reasons. But red blood cells, for instance, don't have mitochondria. So they can't go through oxidative phosphorylation, aerobic versus anaerobic energy production. People know those terms. Aerobic means with air, and that you need mitochondria for that. Okay, so your red blood cells don't have mitochondria, so they can't do that. So they'll go down the anaerobic pathway, and they'll produce lactate. That lactate goes back to your liver, and it gets turned through gluconeogenesis to make more glucose. So there's constant recycling, right? So your red blood cells and a few other tissues will be only using glucose. They'll make lactate, go back to your liver, make more glucose, shove it out for the red blood cells, right? So the vast majority of gluconeogenesis comes from glycerol pathway and also lactate. Even when you're not in ketosis, you're constantly going through gluconeogenesis anyway. So if this was a stress state, this caused stress, well, you'd always be going through that anyway.
Mhm.
And also, even if something requires cortisol, or maybe we'll give a little bit of a bump in cortisol, that doesn't mean that's putting you in a stress state. A stress state can cause high cortisol levels, but that doesn't mean that when cortisol is present, that causes a stress state. That's putting the cart before the horse. It's the other
Mhm.
way around. So stress state can cause high cortisol, but higher cortisol doesn't cause a stress state. It does other things. But when you're even going through other forms of gluconeogenesis, even if that does mildly bump up your cortisol again in that first little bit, that transiently for a couple of weeks, because you're transitioning over, you're not getting that deep ketosis yet, where you're going through predominantly the glycerol pathway, you might have a bit of a rise, but it never goes above physiological levels. And so that's not causing a stress state. It can be caused by a
Mhm.
stress state, but it doesn't cause a stress state. And it's not a stress hormone. It's a hormone. It does a lot of things, and it can become affected when you're in a stress state. Same with adrenaline, epinephrine, and people say, well, you need cortisol to start lipolysis. No, cortisol can cause lipolysis. Adrenaline can cause lipolysis, but so does glucagon and other things too. And that's the main driver. And so you don't actually need epinephrine or cortisol to start lipolysis or start fat burning. That's a normal process. It just happens on its own. When we have people that are in the hospital and they have low blood sugar and they're in a coma and they're dying, Maybe they took too much insulin, maybe some other reason they're diabetic or something like that. Their blood sugar's too low and they're in a coma. We don't give them a shot of cortisol. We don't give them a shot of epinephrine, adrenaline, to raise their blood sugar. We give them a shot of glucagon because that's what causes lipolysis and gluconeogenesis and triggers gluconeogenesis. That's the main driver of gluconeogenesis. And so people are trying to bastardize these very normal biochemical processes, not understanding them and trying to misrepresent them. And then when you point out, actually, there's actually 5 pathways for gluconeogenesis. Some that don't even show up in the textbooks, but are in the literature. And that's only one of them. That's the last one that your body is going to go through. So, this isn't correct. And then they try to work around, oh, well, no, that's not really, it's just excuses. And it's people that are just trying to push an agenda. And, for that person in particular, I 100% think that he is getting paid to do this, because out of nowhere, he has a professional team working with him. He's got scripts. He's got professional camera working. He's got a boom mic because he's there with his shirt off. There's no mic there. So someone's standing up with a boom. Obviously, he's got a big production team. He's being scripted. This guy does not have a college degree in biology or biochemistry. So, he's reading a script. And he's getting it wrong. I mean, he's doing it from people, the Ray Peters, I know who does it, but it's incorrect. And so they're spreading a lot of misinformation, which is getting people hurt. And these are the same people that were saying that, well, you should do a low-fat carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet because, well, fat's bad. Okay, well, no, that's not bad. Fat's been vilified for 40, 50 years, and we've gotten into the worst state of health that humanity has ever experienced. And so there's other people encouraging like a low-fat carnivore diet because they say, well, animals are pretty lean and our ancestors would have eaten wild animals. Like, no, the muscle bodies are lean because they haven't been force-fed a whole bunch of carbs to make that intramuscular fat, which is pathological. But they have plenty of subcutaneous fat. They have plenty of fat around the muscles and around the body. We just cut all that off because we've been told for the last 50 years, fat's bad, cut it off. And so we see his muscle body going, wow, there's no fat there. These animals must be lean. Like, no, because you cut it all off and you've thrown it away. Also, are whales lean? Are seals lean? Are polar bears lean? Because that's what people are actually eating in the wild on carnivore diets, like the Inuit, right? And we'd always go after the fattiest animals. We went after the megafauna. In fact, we hunted a lot of them out into extinction, right? And there might have been some sort of cataclysmic event in the last ice age, at the end of the last ice age. But either way, a lot of these things were the ones we were hunting. Woolly mammoths, elephants, giant sloths, cave bears, things like that. Bigger animals that had more fat, especially when you're up in the Arctic Circle during the ice ages. You have bigger animals with a lot of fat on them because they need that to survive the cold. And that's where our ancestors were, and that's what we were hunting. And so that's what we were eating. So no, we don't do a low-fat carnivore diet biologically. But that can cause harm because you're eating too little fat. Fat is an essential nutrient, but it's also an essential energy source. Because if you're predominantly getting your calories and your energy from protein, that is an inefficient way of getting energy. So you don't feel as good. You don't have as much energy. But also you have to take the nitrogen group off the amino acid, and that gets broken off and that gets turned into ammonia. Ammonia gets then turned into urea by the liver, and you pee this out. That's why it's called urine from urea. And you can see this sometimes if your urea starts going up a bit, and like, okay, I'm eating too much protein, I need more fat. That's how you tell. If you really go way too much, and you can overwhelm your liver's ability to turn that ammonia into urea, and you got a buildup of ammonia, and that causes liver damage, that causes neurological damage. You can lose your hair. It's called protein poisoning or rabbit starvation. If people read up on Lewis and Clark when they explored out west, hundreds of years ago, they say very distinctly that the people that focused on the fat and ate the fattiest parts of the animals, those are the ones that survived. The other ones that ate really lean, they all died. And you need that. You have to have that high fat content in order to avoid protein poisoning. Now, so they're told, or maybe they're said, oh, you should do dairy. And a lot of people do carnivore now, and they're saying, oh, well, do I just eat meat? That's not really interesting. And you're seeing people do all these recipes with tons of dairy and things like that, which can absolutely make you put on weight because it has casomorphins that tell the baby animal, eat more and store energy because babies are vulnerable and they need to grow quickly so that they can defend themselves, right? So milk and milk products are there to make babies grow quickly. We get those same signals and we store energy and we can put on fat. So if you're like, wow, I'm putting on fat, and they say, wow, that's because you're eating too much fat. Fat makes you fat. No, it doesn't. Fat actually triggers lipolysis and is the only thing that doesn't raise insulin, which is the fat storage hormone. So eat too much dairy, then they put on weight. Then they say, okay, well, you need to go lean. Or maybe they start out with the lean anyway because they see these influencers that say, no, you need to eat really lean. So they start really lean. They get very sick. They don't feel well. They have terrible energy. They start losing their hair. They start losing their health because they're getting protein poisoning. And then someone says, that's that ketosis. You're in that stress state. It's so horrible for you. And then you add in carbs and yeah, you feel better because now you don't have protein poisoning anymore. Right. And then it's sort of, then you've sort of convinced yourself that that must have been that ketosis thing. No, if you just eaten fat, you would have had the same or even better results. Or they say, oh, you need to fast the hell out of yourself. No, you're not fasting enough. No, you don't. No, you don't. You actually want to eat enough. You want to eat fatty meat until it stops tasting good. If you fast for too long, you can depress your metabolism because you're in a famine, right? And your body says, okay, well, we need to shut this down. And you'll lose weight for a while, but then it'll temper off. And we have studies showing that. The Minnesota starvation experiment in World War II actually studied that. And people lost a ton of weight, and then they just leveled off because their metabolism slowed down to get them through the famine, to get them through the winter sort of thing. So you don't want that. You want to encourage your metabolism. You want to eat fatty meat until it stops tasting good. So your body knows that you have plenty of food available. It doesn't need to store things and just keep you safe and alive. You're in a time of abundance. And then and then don't eat too little fat because that can cause protein poisoning. So they're capitalizing and going off this sort of trend where people have started eating more dairy and less fat, and they're coming into problems and they're having difficulty. That's never been the way that carnivore was taught. It's just fatty meat, eggs, and water, and get enough fat. You never go lean, and you don't overdo fasting or even fasting at all. You just eat meat. And that's what's been working since time immemorial. And then people start changing it up, try to reinvent the wheel, usually for just massive fat loss early on so that they can sell a product, which is what these people are doing. They don't care about your health at the end of it. They just want to show rapid weight loss quickly and look at me, my program works so well. No, you're destroying people's health and you're giving them bad habits going on for the rest of their life. What I do is just say, hey, this is how you eat healthy for the rest of your life. The weight will happen. Some people lose weight quickly, some don't. But long term, you'll lose the weight and you'll improve your health. And that's the most important thing. And so there's some people that are getting hurt by that, being told the wrong thing. And they say, this is because of ketosis and all that sort of stuff. And it seems to make sense, but it's all a bunch of rubbish.
Yeah, and it does, what you mentioned about an agenda. I feel like there always is an agenda, right? And I know something that in the animal documentary that you said that I'd known a little bit about, but not as much in all the context was the history of, so in the high carb diet, there's the whole idea of we need to eat cereal for breakfast, like this whole grain breakfast, right? The Kellogg story. And that kind of blew my mind. And that definitely got a lot of alarms ringing in my own brain when it comes to a high carb diet, when it comes to starting your morning with carbohydrates, especially. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of cereal and Dr. Kellogg and how cereal became part of a balanced breakfast?
Yeah, well, it was very good marketing on his part. The breakfast is the most important meal of the day. It came from marketing from Kellogg's. They're saying breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Eat Kellogg's cereal and start your day with this. Dr. Kellogg's was a very influential man. Politicians went to him. Henry Ford, I believe, went to him, and other. He was in Battle Creek, Michigan, so he was very close to Ford, and I think other, captains of industry and things like that, politicians and movie stars went to him and things like that as well. He's very influential, very, very. He's one of the first doctors to the stars sort of things. And he pushed a vegetarian diet or even a vegan diet, and especially for the temperance of lust and masturbation. So people would take their children to them. He's he's masturbating. They thought at that time this was a major issue, and that this was a major driver of sin and depravity worldwide was masturbation and sexual impulses and things like that, as opposed to being a natural hormonal instinct that everybody in every life form of life has. He would treat them with vegetarian diets because he felt that these would suppress the sexual urges. This goes back to the early 1800s, where the temperance movement and the puritanical movement of, sex is the worst thing that could ever happen, and people masturbating. This is where all this sin and evil is derived from. Well, I swear to God, that's actually what they thought at the time. And so it was argued since the early 1800s that if you eat a bland plant-based diet, they felt spices would make you spicy, that is what would suppress your sexual urges. It's where graham crackers come from. Sylvester Graham, he made graham crackers in the mid 1800s, like the 1850s, in order to suppress sexual urges in kids.
What? Yeah. I did not know that.
Yeah. So God. A lot of this stuff is like that. Yeah. So Kellogg's extended that, and if you think about it, he's sort of an extension of Sylvester, because Sylvester Graham influenced a lady named Ellen G. White, who then became one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And one of the founding principles was based on lust, and that there was already this for 50 years with people saying, hey, you need to reduce the amount of meat that you need to suppress lust. And lust is one of the 7 deadly sins, so this is a big deal. And so she, whether, I don't know the veracity of this, but she says that she had a vision from God that said, meat is a sin because it causes lustful feelings. And so everyone has to stop eating meat because meat causes lust, and lust is a sin. And so now this is codified in religion. That was one of the founding principles of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, was basically don't eat meat because it causes lust. And she was very outspoken against this. She was a big part of the temperance movement, and really about, making sure that parents wouldn't let their kids masturbate and things like that, or adults didn't do it either. She wrote a book called A Solemn Appeal to Mothers. And in that, there was a line that said, paraphrasing, that if your child masturbates but once, it's like holding a gun to their breast and pulling the trigger. They are dead in that instant, right? So she took this very seriously. John Harvey Kellogg, later become Dr. Kellogg, was a child of one of the founding members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. His father told him, this is a prophet from God. Everything that she's saying is coming from God's mouth, right? And he was her typesetter for her books. And so he's letting this out, going like, this is the word of God coming out, right? This is the New Testament, And so he took that very, very serious at the time. And that sort of had a falling out later on. But as a kid, that really imprinted upon him. And so he basically dedicated the rest of his life after medical school to try to suppress sexual urges and lustful feelings and things like that. Came up with plant-based alternatives, plant-based, meat sort of derivatives, like a big nut log instead of like a roast and all that sort of stuff. And he came up with Kellogg cereal with his brother, and they marketed this and pushed that out. But that was even advertised at the time to suppress sexual urges. Right? They didn't even say, hey, this is really good for you. But no, they're like, hey, we need to suppress sexual urges. So he didn't hide what he was doing. He was saying, hey, this is what we need to do. And people were into that at the time. And people would bring their kids to him at Battle Creek Sanitarium, which is the name of his hospital. That was part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They have sanitariums. And then think of the name in Australia, the number one, the top cereal producers in Australia is Sanitarium Foods, which is owned wholly by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They've never paid taxes on this. It's like just a church bake sale, right? So this company has revenue in the billions and have been around for 100 years. They've never paid taxes. So the Seventh-day Adventist Church is not just like some, just local congregation. They are an intensely wealthy organization. They have over 20 different cereal companies and corporations and things like that they control. Kellogg's was separate. Kellogg, he made that himself with his brother. So that's sort of private, not owned by the church, but influenced by the church. And then Kellogg's influenced other people. So they said, okay, well, we want to do cereal companies too. And that's why they started Sanitarium and other things. And, Post cereals, Mr. Post was a patient of Dr. Kellogg's, and something like 36 different cereal companies were all founded in Battle Creek, Michigan, all just from his influence, because he was a very influential man. I remember, you may not know this guy, but he's a classical historian named Will Durant, who wrote The History of Civilization, which is like a 13-volume novel, because from the beginning of civilization all up until the modern era. Amazing work. He wrote I, Claudius, things like that. That later became a movie. And I remember reading a quote from him talking about how, well, there's these two things, and these guys believe this, and me and Dr. Kellogg, we think this other thing, and maybe you agree with us, maybe you agree with them, but I've always sort of found that you can never go wrong listening to Dr. Kellogg. I'm like, no, come on, surely not. But he was very, very influential, and so some of the top minds, literary historian, political minds, listened to him, and this was what he was saying. He was saying that it's not good to masturbate. He was so into this. He thought that even post-marital sex, having sex with your husband or wife, was actually still sinful. Just lust was a sin. And so he was married for decades, and he never consummated the marriage, supposedly. Never had sex with his wife. But so all their kids are adopted, and all the Kellogg's line, they're all from that adopted line of children. And but he was an inventor, and he would invent these plant-based meats, and he also invented different medical equipment, like a machine that could give automated enemas, so it could pump in 60 liters of water in and out of your colon every minute, right? So a high-powered just pressure washer enema thing that he would give himself 2 of those a day.
A day. Wow.
Yeah. So maybe some pent-up sort of issues there.
Yeah.
But in any case, he pushed this because he felt that this was, he needed to suppress sexual urges, and this was really important. And people at the time thought so as well. So people brought their children to him, and he would put them on plant-based diets, change their diet out, suppress their sexual urges, give them cornflakes. Interesting about cornflakes, and why he chose that, I don't think he knew this at the time, but we have studies now that show that if you have oysters, which are most rich nutrient source for zinc. Zinc is required for testosterone production and other hormonal production, thyroid function. That if you eat oysters with corn tortillas, that blocks out 100% of zinc absorption.
Oh my gosh.
So if you're eating, these corn products, you block out 100% of zinc, and over time, your testosterone is just going to tank, right? And that's another reason why I think people going carnivore end up having their testosterone and hormones improve, because they're just getting out of their own way and letting their body produce hormones as they should. And so give these people, cornflakes and plant-based foods and all that sort of stuff. Then you would also circumcise them without anesthetic.
Oh my gosh.
So do it awake without anesthetic, boys and girls, unfortunately. So this is female genital mutilation, which most people have been up in arms about, at least in recent decades and generations, when this happens elsewhere in the world. And he was doing this right here in America, and this was on purpose. And he would do it when they were awake without anesthetic, because he said, and he wrote about this. You can look it up, and that pain involved was teach them, like, oh, that's a bad area, I don't want that. And then they couldn't touch that area for a while. So they would just stay away from it. Every time they told it was pain, ooh, and they associate that area with pain instead of pleasure, right? And that was part of the treatment, was actually torturing them out of it. And or use like caustic materials like acids to like burn the clitoris and labia, so ever being graphic, but that's what he would do, or he would cut them off and remove them, and then circumcise boys and things like that, and make it very difficult. And the thing is that he was the one who influenced the medical establishment to recommend that American boys get circumcised. It's nowhere else in the world. And I swear, people still say this, when you mention this, they're like, no, that's for hygiene reasons. It's just that's what Dr. Kellogg said, but that's not actually true. And so if you don't wash yourself, then yes, you have a small increased risk of penile cancer. Small. Because penile cancer is very rare. And so even if you double or triple your risk, you're still doubling or tripling a very small number. It's still a small number. But if you just practice normal hygiene, just wash yourself, there's no difference. There's absolutely no difference in any of these outcomes. And in fact, you have a higher risk of getting sexually transmitted diseases if you are circumcised, because the skin is more taut, and it's more easy to tear and break and leave little tears and openings for an infection to get into, for example. So he convinced the medical establishment that this was a medical this would be not necessarily a medical necessity, but this would be beneficial. And they worked with it, and he tried to do that for girls too, but they're like, nah, look, we're not buying that one, right? So thank
Thank
God
goodness.
that happened. Yeah, exactly. And but that's where his head was at. This guy was just up at night, just worrying like, oh, there's people masturbating. I mean, why do you care? Like, why do you care? And so, to the point that you affect policy and recommendations from doctors that people should circumcise their children, because it makes it more difficult for them to masturbate, because the skin is more tight, and so it's difficult. And then people figured out lube, and that was game over. But they didn't walk back that, like, all right, well, you're doing it anyway. They still thought that this was the right thing to do, right? From a health, it's not. It has nothing to do with that. It was purely to try to make it more difficult and less enjoyable to masturbate and have sex. And that's, I mean, first of all, none of his damn business. And second of all, obviously wasn't the root of all evil out there is not that. So that was the progenitor of the whole processed food industry. It was really Dr. Kellogg. And that was what it was for. It was to replace meat in order to suppress sexual urges. It obviously has a life of its own now. And it was so successful as a business model that this grew up into these massive multinational giants that we have today that have their own profit incentive now, and probably aren't trying to suppress masturbation. But this Seventh-day Adventist church has a profit incentive, and also has an ideological incentive, because they still promulgate the idea that meat is bad and sinful, and you shouldn't eat it, and you should eat a more plant-based diet. And they try to get this in the medical institutions by founding something called lifestyle medicine, which is a great idea on its surface of changing your diet and lifestyle just to improve people's health so they can come off medications as opposed to on more medication. Totally on board with that. That is what I do. But the diet that they promote is a vegan diet, right? It's a plant-based diet, right? And so, nice idea, but it's actually a Trojan horse to try to sneak in that vegan approach as well. And the problem is that they have multiple, hundreds of medical institutions around the world. They have a medical school in Loma Linda, California, that you have to be a Seventh-day Adventist church member to even apply, right? And then you have people like Dr. Gundry, who wrote The Plant Paradox, who was a professor at Loma Linda for 19 years. And if they don't let non-SDA members into the school, I would have a hard time believing that they would let a non-SDA member in to teach as well. And but either way, he has ties with them. And so now he wrote a book called The Plant Paradox, talking about, hey, look, plants have toxins. They don't want to be eaten, and they will try to kill you in order for them to survive. But it's a paradox, because you can't eat meat either. Meat kills you too. So what the hell do you do? Well, the definition of paradox. Yeah, exactly. To be a breatharian and suck in the life force of the universe. The thing is that the definition of a paradox are two mutually exclusive things that cannot coexist. It's a paradox. No, it's not. You just don't know the full story yet. So either plants don't have toxins and aren't bad for you, or meat's not bad for you. Because his paradox was, plants are toxic, you can't eat them, but you can't eat anything else. So what the hell do you do? Well, you take his supplement that reduces the damage from lectins. I'm very, very evolutionary based, because I'm sure we had that supplement, 240,000 years ago. But, plants do have toxins. We know that. I mean, he actually showed that very clearly in his book. And there's very hard evidence that it's just a whole, institute of and scientific field of botany. We have libraries full of textbooks about all the different toxins that plants have and the harms they cause humans and livestock. So that's right. And you just got the other part wrong, that you can't eat meat. Of course you can. I think of Gundry as a sort of an honorary carnivore, because he's so close. He's got all these core principles, but he just has that religious hang up that meat is bad. It's not bad. It's really important for us. It's how we're designed. It's how we're made. And there are a lot of people that come from that as well. The 1977 USDA declaration saying that, or congressional report and those sort of things coming around saying, oh, cholesterol is bad and all that sort of stuff, were written and influenced by Seventh-day Adventist church members. The 2015 WHO declaration saying that processed meat causes cancer, even though they cherry-picked 30 out of 800 studies that fit their narrative, and even then was only an 18% increased risk association, when epidemiology, if it's not 200% or more, basically you don't consider it a valid because it's just background noise. And yet they said, no, this definitively shows that processed meat causes cancer. And of course, it doesn't. When you look at all those 800 studies, there isn't even a slight correlation.
Mm-hmm.
Seventh-day Adventist church members, vegans, vegetarians are on that panel, and they were the ones who were pushing that. And there was a guy who was on that panel that publicly came out and said that was the hardest thing he's ever had to go through professionally. And he said that they threw out hundreds of papers that were high quality and showed no connection between meat and cancer, even processed meat and cancer, and certainly not unprocessed red meat. And he said, you guys need to clear your bias. You're all vegans, vegetarians, and Seventh-day Adventist church members. You need to put that on here, that's your bias and you have a conflict of interest. And they refused. And so yeah, there's a lot of them in there. But so they're still influencing policy. They still have that 1800s ideology influencing, 2025 politics, medicine, and recommendations and guidelines. But then they started this whole, hydra of processed food industries that now are these multi-billion-dollar organizations. I mean, they make hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, they just from the SNAP program, Coca-Cola makes like $18 billion a year just from food stamps in America, And so it's a massive industry. And so they, along with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, are the main providers and progenitors of producers of nutritional research, because it's pushing their agenda. It's pushing a plant-based agenda, either to sell you processed plant products or to push an 1800s ideology, religious ideology. And because they have those medical institutions, Seventh-day Adventist Church, they are the peer reviewers. They do the peer review process. And so if you put a paper in, say, hey, I found this thing that says that a carnivore diet's really good and is reversing his diseases, like rejected by peer review, right? And so they're the gatekeepers. And if what you're putting out doesn't fit with their worldview or their profit incentive or their religious ideology, it's not getting through. It's not getting past the gatekeepers, right? So you go to other places and things like that that don't use those sorts of gatekeepers, but the Adventists still fund a lot of research, and the processed food industry funds a lot of, billions of dollars worth of research. Just Coca-Cola alone, back 10 years ago, 2015, they spent $119 million just in 2015 on nutritional research. What do you think that came up with? Well, there's one study that came up that said, if you feed rats Coca-Cola, it makes them lose weight. Oh yes, Coca-Cola is a weight loss drink. Get out of here! Like, shut up. It's just nonsense. They're not real studies.
No.
They're fake. They're propaganda. They're marketing. This is just part of their marketing budget. And so they pay people to just write up a whole bunch of bullshit. They get their friends to peer review it and publish it. And then they can say, oh, look at this. Coca-Cola is really good for you, or at least not bad for you. But in that instance, they were saying it was good for you. It helped with weight loss.
Wow.
Right? So that's what we're up against. That's why the literature is as muddy and clogged as it is, because for 100 years, you have had those influences on the current literature and academia and the institutions, because the American Nutrition Dietetics Association was founded by a Seventh-day Adventist Church member, Lena Cooper, who wrote the first university textbook on nutrition in 1925. And that is still in print in its modern, 50th edition or whatever. But it's all plant-based. So they didn't infiltrate the institutions. Sometimes you get corporate capture, and these companies will take over, like the medical institutions, which has happened. But they didn't even do that. They founded a lot of these institutions, right? So it's not, the Wizard of Oz. It's not them. Ignore the man behind the curtain. It's not the man behind the curtain. They're like 3-4 curtains back. They've been pulling the string since the 1800s, and they're still doing it today. And of course, there's that profit motive. It's just taken a track of its own, and so they are very much incentivized to keep that money train rolling, because they make a lot of money. And just lastly, very quickly, the processed food industry and the pharmaceutical companies are often cross-invested in each other massively, and so because they benefit from each other, because you have this processed food garbage that makes people very sick. And then they need all these medicines to sort of try to temper that illness. And then you have all these doctors saying, you need to go plant-based, you need to go plant-based, you need to cut all this meat. That's what's causing all of your illnesses. And they buy more of that processed junk food, because when you go vegan, you go vegetarian, you stop eating meat, you don't just eat fresh quinoa salads and grow your own garden and things like that. Some people do, but most people buy packaged pre-made junk. And so that is just this revolving door, just back and forth, helping each other buy more junk food, get more sick, buy more junk food.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. This is a lot to unpack. My brain is in like a million places at once right now. That's wild. So, because I'm like, okay, so we were talking earlier even about like a carb heavy plant-based diet and the effects on fertility, and then hearing about like the lust component. And I'm like, yeah, if something's tanking your libido, isn't there also a component that it might be tanking your fertility? Like
Yep.
it's connected. There's a reason we're biologically driven to have sex, and it's to procreate and to further
Mhm.
the human race. And I'm like, I just feel like with the whole masturbation component, I'm like, why can't y'all just have a conversation with your kids? If you don't want them to do it, why
Yep.
can't you just like have open dialogue, and then like you should have sex with your spouse? Hot take. Like my mind is literally blown. But okay,
Mm.
so really fast, I want to touch on this, and we'll go back to on topic. Everything you mentioned about circumcision and just how that connects to this deep conspiracy, right? I was just having a conversation with some friends who are pregnant, or one's pregnant and one who has little kids. And they're asking me, because I'm a health coach, people always ask me like really fringe questions every day. And they're like, what do
Mhm.
you think about circumcision? And I don't have kids. I'm like, I was like, lately I've been feeling a little weird about it. I don't know. Like, if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have been like, absolutely. Like, of course. And lately I've been like, I don't know. The more I pull back layers on the medical system, the more I'm like, I don't know. So if you had like a baby boy today, would you just not circumcise?
No, definitely not. No, there's
Okay.
no need, there's no purpose, right? There's a religious purpose, fine. If there's some sort of phimosis or some sort of issue, and okay, down the road, fine. If it's for actual medical reason, but just blanket barn door, everyone gets a circumcision. No, there's no actual medical justification for that. There's no health justification for that. Teach them to use soap. There's no
Yeah.
issues. There's no different, right? As
Yeah.
far as penile cancer is concerned. But you actually do have a higher risk of STDs and other problems down the road. I mean, and it's a medical procedure. You're putting a very sharp scalpel next to a very, very delicate part of the body,
On a
and
baby.
accidents happen on a baby.
Yeah.
And accidents happen. And so people have actually removed like the tip of the penis and things like that, permanently marred them. I mean, it's very rare, but it has happened. And
Mhm.
so court cases and things like that. And I don't know if that's how often that would happen, like in like a surgical setting, but like at a bris, with a rabbi doing it just
Mhm.
by his hand, the baby's awake and moving around. I mean, it's a bit more of a higher complication risk if you're doing it that way. And there have been court issues with that. But either way, I mean, that's part of the child's body. It's actually meant to be there. We're
Mhm.
biologically designed to have a foreskin. There is a purpose there, and it provides protection and laxity of the skin, so you can actually have sex and fornicate in a more normal um, fashion that doesn't cause pain and tears the skin and causes problems down the road. Increases sensitivity of the member as well. Like if you have to take that skin away, you're just constant rubbing and touching it. It just dampens down the nerves and the sensitivity of that as well, of the glans penis as well. So there are a lot of downsides to it, and there are, just from a barn door, everyone gets it, there are no upsides. As long as you practice normal hygiene. If there's an issue, something happens and sort of closes off, or you can't get it, whatever. There are reasons to have a circumcision down the road,
Mhm.
but no, I would absolutely not. I will not be circumcising my kids in the future. No.
Yeah. Okay. I'm really glad that like we cleared this up, because I have gotten
Mhm.
this question, and my philosophy has always been more from the like, what does that do attachment style, like safety feelings? I've been learning more about like birth
Mm,
trauma and all these things. And
yeah,
like, I feel like doing that to a baby at a young age, like, because your brain doesn't remember but your body does, right?
yeah,
Like your nervous system remembers all the
yeah,
trauma that you ever experienced. And I was like, being not a doctor, I'm like trying to explain this in a way that's like
mm,
not incorrect, but also like just the,
yeah,
the gut feeling I've been having. I'm like, yeah, like you don't remember, but the body does. Like
yeah.
there's a line of thought that like people who are traumatized from birth can carry that into adulthood, right? So I'm like, I don't
Well,
know. So,
There's studies showing that actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to mention that actually because when you have childhood trauma, physical pain and distress, that those children, this is, they're looking at population studies, there's epidemiology, so you don't necessarily have a randomized control trial, all that sort of stuff. But we see this trend that children that have severe, physical trauma or some sort of, very big pain sort of event, they are more timid throughout the rest of their life as adults.
Hmm.
It sort of affects how they develop as a human being. And I've always wondered that if you're doing the circumcision for religious purpose or whatever, and especially if you're not using like anesthetic or whatever, all of a sudden you're just like, oh, there's pain, I'm getting cut, and you're freaking out and screaming, and nothing's getting better. Like, I mean, is that going to affect you down the road? I bet you it is.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, we do have those studies. And so I would be worried about the same exact thing.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, people can always consent to something later on. Sure, you have to like
Yeah,
take the
exactly.
anti-boner pills or something, whatever, but like whatever. It's a price to pay. I feel like when it comes to things, I'm just team like I don't want to put anything in a child or do anything to a child that they can't consent to.
Yeah.
Like, I just feel like, and this, that's my personal philosophy, and people get mad at me for saying that, but I'm like, that's just what I think personally. Okay. So then, totally a topic I did not think we would cover today, to be honest, but I'm glad we did because I think it's an important one. So then, kind
Yeah.
of backtracking to, you mentioned Loma Linda, and this is what came to mind with, the Seventh Day Adventist, like college. And then, I've heard from people like, yeah, Loma Linda. I had a friend who was considering going there for grad school years ago, and he was like, well, it's a blue zone, blue zones are so healthy and da 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 da. So then I'm hearing the Seventh Day Adventist component, the blue zone component. Do you think blue zones are a scam?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. So the again, it's the Adventist study, right?
Uh,
Done by the Adventists, on the Adventists, done for, by, and of the Adventists. So this can be biased. They're not all vegetarians, by the way. Only some of them are. And so, maybe a higher proportion than the rest of the population, but it's like 15-20%. And the other would be influenced in that direction. But what they're also influenced to do is not smoke, not drink, not do drugs, have a strong family community, go to church, and not expose themselves to all the different sorts of things that get people killed. And so on average, they have about 3-4 year longer average life expectancy than the average American. Okay, according to their study that has not been externally validated, right? Okay, well, so do the Mormons, and the Mormons have the exact same increased life expectancy because they don't smoke, they don't drink, they don't do drugs, they have a strong sense of family and community, and those are all beneficial to health outcomes and longevity. They don't have any restrictions on what they eat, right? So in fact, they eat much closer to the average American diet, just the average person. Seventh-day Adventists, again, it's only about 15-20% of them actually listen to that. The rest of them just eat whatever the hell they eat, right? And so it's much more likely that this is due to those other factors. Also, it's their own study. And I know people in the Seventh-day Adventist church, and they're like, yeah, people aren't healthy here. Like, especially the ones that are really plant-based, they're racked with autoimmune issues and metabolic issues and things like that. And that's just, someone's, observation, being within the community, so take that for what it is. But it's a couple years. It's basically exactly the same as the Mormons. And there are definitely other confounding factors there that would 100% influence longevity and health. The other thing is that the blue zones, that whole being called something a blue zone or whatever, the blue zone diet and blue zone this and blue zone that trademark, blue zone, all that stuff, is owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So they choose who are the blue zones and all that sort of stuff. So Dan Buettner is at least affiliated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I don't know what his religious convictions are, but he sold the rights to the blue zones to the Seventh-day Adventist Church for like $68 million, right? And he went to these areas who my friends have been to, who research scientists, and went to these areas to study other things, and completely misrepresented what they went to Sardinia. They said this is a blue zone. They only eat meat once a week, and it's all plant based and all that sort of stuff. And my friend, Professor Bill Schindler, who's a professor of archaeology and paleoanthropology at University of Maryland. I think he's moved on now, but he was a professor there for years. He went to Sardinia. He was studying something else, and he lived with the people who Dan Buettner originally studied. And first thing out of their mouth was, "Why does everybody think we're vegetarians?"
Oh,
You know?
amazing.
And he's just like, "What?" And he's like, "Yeah, I don't know where that came from." He said every single household he went into, there's just trays of meat and cheese, meat and cheese, meat and cheese, meat and cheese, right? And bit of maybe some fresh tomatoes and basil and some olives and things like that. That's basically it. They're just carnivores other than that. Just meat and dairy, maybe some homemade wine, things like that occasionally. And then once a week, they would roast a whole sheep on a spit with all the organs and everything like that. And they would just spend like 6-8 hours just hanging out, just eating a bunch of meat and hanging out as a family in a community. And so they came up to him. They were like, "Hey, tomorrow we're going to eat meat. Oh, it's going to be great." And he's like, "What are you talking about? You're going to eat meat tomorrow? Like, you're eating more meat here than I eat at home." And they explained to him that once a week they have this whole big barbecue, put a whole animal on the spit and have, all the family and friends all come together. And so Dan Buettner went and said, "Oh, they only eat meat once a week."
Oh, wow.
They
Because of the
only
one like potluck lamb.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they only eat one entire sheep once a week, right? In one sitting.
Yeah.
And so, but because their language barrier, they're saying, "Oh yeah, we eat meat once a week. We eat meat," and that's what they mean by that. They eat an entire sheep, but every other day they're eating their salamis and preserved meats and things like that, and cheeses. And so they misrepresented that, misrepresented how much meat these other blue zones are as well, but also didn't include the other blue, like Okinawa. The older generation, the ones that are living to be 90 over 100 and things like that, they actually eat a lot of meat. Now they don't eat a lot of red meat, and it's all clever wording. You always want to listen out for weasel words, right?
Yeah.
Well, they don't eat a lot of red meat. Okay, well, what about other meat? There's other meat besides red meat. Okay, well, they eat a lot of pork, right? A lot of pork and a lot of fish and things like that. Predominantly, that's what they're eating. And so, they eat a lot of these yams. Okay, well, yams are New World, so they wouldn't be a traditional diet of Japan. And also, is that the only thing they're eating? And if these yams are the best thing in the world, why aren't they all over the world? And people, if that was were our designed food sources, every single human throughout evolution would have had to have access to them on a daily basis or a near daily basis. And in fact, they only existed in the New World. So did not happen when we were evolving. But predominantly they ate meat. And then that's changed. They're eating junk food and all that sort of garbage now. They're saying, "Oh yeah, they're eating more McDonald's, they're eating more meat." No, they're eating less meat. McDonald's has barely any meat. A Big Mac value meal, that's a vegetarian meal. Less than 30% of those calories come from meat. Most of it's coming way less, probably only 10% are coming from meat.
Yeah.
If the definition of a hyper carnivore is any animal like a polar bear that eats over 70% of its calories from meat, then a Big Mac value meal is a hyper vegetarian meal.
Yeah.
And in fact, in America, we consume those guys consume over 80% of their calories, total calories per day, is from plants, mostly carbs.
Oh, wow.
Right? So the American diet, the Western diet, is a hyper vegetarian diet. So you say, we need to get away from this Western meat-based. No. The Western diet is a plant-based diet. It's a hyper vegetarian diet. So they're saying that people in Okinawa, they got McDonald's and they got this and they got this fast food and they got all this meat coming in. No, they got more plants coming in. And so that's a more hyper vegetarian approach. And where actually the traditional diet was more meat-based. They look at the Loma Linda. We talked about that. And they didn't include these other blue zones, such as the Mormons. Okay, why aren't they a blue zone? Because they have the exact same increased life expectancy as the Seventh-day Adventists, who again are not all vegetarian. Only some of them are. And then what about people in Hong Kong? People in Hong Kong have the highest life expectancy average from birth on Earth right now, right? Of developed nations that we can study. And they eat the most meat per person per year. They eat the most meat. And that includes fish and chicken and all these other sorts of things. It's not just red meat. It's all meats. And they eat the most of it per person per year. Okay, what about the anti-blue zones? Such as the entire subcontinent of India. You got like 1.4 billion people who are largely vegetarian. In India, they eat an average of 3 kilos, which is about 8 pounds of meat per person per year.
Oh my gosh, that's it?
That's it.
That's
That's it.
crazy.
And they have low obesity rates, and yet one of the highest metabolic disease rates on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the highest diabetes rates on Earth, and one of the highest chronic cardiovascular disease rates on Earth. I saw a statistic at one point that said that people in India, 1 in 4 of them will die of a heart attack, specifically.
Oh my
And 1 in
gosh.
3 men will die of a heart attack in India. They're all
Oh my-
plant-based. They're all vegetarian, right?
Yeah.
So how are we saying that meat is causing heart disease and cancer when these people eat no meat, basically, and that's the main source of mortality is chronic disease like heart disease. The top causes of death for vegans and vegetarians:
No.
heart disease, cancer,
Oh my
right?
gosh.
So these it did not change. And so if we're saying that meat causes heart disease and cancer, then eliminating it should at least reduce that.
Yeah.
Doesn't, right? And I would say that it will probably increase it because there's a protective mechanism from having proper nutrition. Real simple. If you're not eating meat, you're not getting up B12. You're not going to be able to metabolize homocysteine. Homocysteine, when that builds up, it damages your arteries directly and builds up damage and plaque and heart disease. And this is a known cardiovascular disease risk. And so if you have low B12, which you will on a vegan vegetarian diet, unless you're heavily supplementing, but people don't even realize how much they need to supplement because, again, we're in a hyper vegetarian population, and the reference ranges that we use for lab tests are just averages of the population. So if you're testing the average B12 of a hyper vegetarian population, you are going to get a low average. And because everybody's low, now no one's low because it's just an average. Why I'm telling you, the entire reference range that we use all the way around the world are most commonly lower than what the optimal range would be. And so here in Australia, at least at the one of the main labs that we use here in Perth, if your B12 is not high, you're low. And
Wow.
that's typically the case in America and elsewhere as well. So they don't even realize that they're so low. And so their homocysteine can be high, and that can damage your arteries as well. I have a friend of mine, Dr. Ankur Verma, who's an ER doctor in India. So he's big institutions. You're getting thousands of people running through there all the time. He's doing a massive project, which is great because you can have a massive research population, and so he's got hundreds and hundreds of patients who've come in with heart attacks and strokes and things like that. Some of these guys are in their 20s or 30s. He had a 17-year-old that had a massive heart attack and had to get stents put in at 17, vegetarian, right? Can't blame that on the meat. And then people say, and that puts to rest that whole argument that, well, all these people would have been dying of that, but they all died in their 30s. So it's just we're living longer. So we get 17, you're getting a heart attack? No, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You can't blame that one on just, we're just getting older and that's how it is. No, that's not true. And younger and younger people are getting worse and worse chronic diseases. So this is obviously something environmental. So he found, well, it's preliminary. They haven't finished their study yet, but some of the preliminary research has shown that all these people coming in with heart attacks and strokes, they basically all of them have normal or even ideal LDL and cholesterol, but they also have very lower on the lower side to even very low B12 and elevated homocysteine almost entirely. And almost entirely, they have low HDL and high triglycerides, and that's the important factor there. That shows that you're in increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease is low HDL and high triglycerides and high homocysteine and low B12. And because it's all about damage to your vessels. There are some key things that damage your vessels. Nicotine directly damages vessels. This is why tobacco products are so bad, but also vaping and patches even. The nicotine itself damages your vessels. Homocysteine damages vessels. Glucose, high blood sugar, even in spikes, damages blood vessels through glycation. And funny enough, an oral bacteria called Porphyromonas gingivalis, which causes gingivitis and tooth decay, that is now being shown to be in these arterial plaques, is causing damage in your arteries and causing this plaque buildup. We're even seeing this in glioblastoma brain cancers. There was a study that looked at, I think it was 26 different GBMs, brain tumors, And they found in 89% of the tumors sampled, they found Porphyromonas gingivalis. So, and this has long been known. This was taught to me in medical school, 15, 17 years ago, something like that, that this, that the oral health is a window to your overall health, especially your cardiovascular health. And we just sort of thought of this as like an association, but now we're actually seeing a causal link between the bacteria in your mouth that cause gingivitis and cause poor dental health and can cause arterial sclerosis and things like that, atherosclerosis. And how do you get Porphyromonas gingivalis? You eat carbs, because Porphyromonas gingivalis cannot exist without forming a dual biofilm with Candida, right? Which is sort of like a fungal thing. And so they grow together.
Yeah.
Porphyromonas can't grow without it. And Candida can't grow without carbohydrates. And so if you don't eat carbohydrates, Candida can't grow, Porphyromonas can't grow. And this is why when people go ketogenic, carnivore, things like that, their gum disease just gone within weeks because those bacteria are gone, right? And so now you don't have that bacteria that's going around, potentially, causing brain tumors and cardiovascular disease. That's a hard proof about how we're not designed to eat carbohydrates, is because nothing in the wild is going to eat. Its natural diet will never cause tooth decay. Because if an animal loses its teeth, gets cavities and rots its teeth and loses its teeth, it can't eat and it dies, right? So the natural, now maybe you go outside of that. There's certain bears in certain areas. One's like Kodiak Island. They have perfect teeth because they're eating a whole bunch of fish. There's a lot of meat, and that's why they're a lot bigger than other brown bears as well. Then you have other brown bears, continental brown bears, and grizzlies and things like that. They're not getting into trash cans or eating this or eating that, and they have more tooth rot and things like that. So again, that's showing that they're eating something for survival that's not necessarily optimal. And there's a big difference between what is optimal and what you just have to eat to survive. And people, so optimal for a bear is still going to be meat, and you can see that from polar bears and Kodiak bears that predominantly eat meat, and they're much healthier, they're much bigger, they have better dentition. So no natural diet is going to cause tooth decay, because you'll lose your teeth, you lose the ability to eat, and you die. So by definition, if you are eating something that rots your teeth, it is not meant for you. And carbohydrates breed for the bacteria that rot your teeth, cause gingivitis, cause cavities. And so we know for a cold frozen fact that we are not designed to eat carbohydrates.
Yeah. And that makes you think of even all the people who feed their dogs kibble and their cats, right? And it's like, they're all like, their teeth all do decay when they're like later in years. And I know some people have had to pull their dog's teeth because they're all rotting out.
Yeah.
Like that, it's all checking out. I feel like, this is the issue with me recording episodes in the evening, is I'm not going to sleep tonight. I'm just going to be thinking through all these different like points and like wrapping my brain around it and wanting to debrief with my husband. And he's going to be like, Delaney, just go to bed. But it's fine. Okay. I've loved this chat, and I know you're a busy man, so I don't want to take too much of your day up. So can you please plug where people can find you if they want to go deeper, learn more about carnivore, and just connect with you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much. It was great talking to you. Well, I have a YouTube channel. It's just my name, Anthony Chaffee, MD. That's where most of my videos come out. I have a podcast called Plant Free MD. And so then the audio version, we'll get onto that. That's the main thing. The Instagram, Anthony Chaffee, MD as well. I post there quite commonly also. And then I just have a website, just dranthonychaffee.com. So dranthonychaffee.com. And you can sort of find all my other social media and this. And I actually have a lot of resources there. I have a lot of papers and studies. You can actually put in a search to say cholesterol. It'll come up with videos and also papers on cholesterol and things like that as well, plant toxins, all that sort of stuff. So if people want to sort of investigate more and take a look at those, they can do that there.
Amazing. Well, thank you. I have also loved this chat and learned so much. And you guys, if you love this episode, make sure to give us a 5-star review. Make sure to share this to your story, this episode to your story, and tag Dr. Chaffee and myself. I hope you loved this, and I hope you learned something today. And until next time, we will chat soon.